Frank invited me to talk about New START, analysis of New START, and perhaps get into some of the key points that are now facing us with regard to this treaty. So what I'd like to do is really cut to some very basic points. I could come and essentially give you a litany of the problems that I see with the treaty, and I think there are many. A litany of the problems I see with verification provisions, and I believe there are many. But what I thought I would do instead is to step back a moment and take a look from maybe the 100,000-foot level, because in some ways that's the most important. So the beginning point of thinking about New START at the 100,000-foot level is how we should judge it. In other words, what's the measure of merit for it? What's the metric? How do you actually decide whether it's useful or not? What you have seen here of late are at least three suggestions. One is that we'll induce the Russians to be more cooperative with us on other regional matters. Two, it will induce the allies and other parties to be more cooperative with us on non-proliferation. So the linkage with non-proliferation is presented fairly strongly, particularly with regard to helping with Iran and possibly North Korea. And a third is that it strengthens deterrence. The New START treaty will strengthen deterrence. You tend to see these three put forward by the administration and proponents of the New START treaty. Let's take just a minute to take a look at these three claims on behalf of the treaty. First, the reset with Russia. You all have your own metrics for judging how things are going with Russia, and you all are knowledgeable in this area, so I won't go into any detail. But let me just note that what we've seen on the last few weeks and the last few days with regard to Russia and the reset is a spectacle of Mr. Putin and Mr. Medvedev resorting to Cold War threats to encourage us to think beyond the Cold War. Cold War threats to encourage us to think beyond the Cold War and to see how wonderful the New START treaty is. What about nonproliferation? The bottom line on the nonproliferation claim with regard to New START is that New START truly has no direct bearing on the proliferation threat. It has no direct bearing on the proliferation threat. If there were to be an agreement that was to have a direct bearing on the threat of proliferation and loose nukes and the potential problem of nuclear terrorism, which we all agree is a serious problem, this treaty wouldn't be it. It would be a treaty that, for example, would address the tactical nuclear weapon issues. How New START is related to preventing nuclear proliferation really is very imaginative. It's like the old story you've seen where a physicist has a formula that provides a solution, and on the left side of the board there's a part of the equation, and on the right side of the board there's a part of the equation in the middle that says, and then a miracle happens. Right? I mean, that's how the New START treaty is related to nuclear nonproliferation, and then a miracle happens. It's just the wrong vehicle for addressing that threat, and that threat does need to be addressed. But New START doesn't do it. So what should be the primary basis for judging START, and indeed its primary purpose? The conclusion that I come to is that it should be based on the implications that it holds for U.S. strategic policy missions. And those purposes are deterrence, deterring enemies from various forms of attack against us and our allies, and two, assurance, assuring our allies through the extended nuclear deterrent, deterrence and assurance. Those are the two political objectives that are priorities for the U.S. strategic forces, and so we should look at how New START shapes the force structure to service those primary goals. Let me back up just a second and to say that there are other goals for the strategic forces. There are goals with regard to, possible goals with regard to the military use and goals for damage limitation. But I'm not going to talk about those today because I don't think I'm qualified to discuss war planning. I've been in the Pentagon, I know war planners, and that's not what policy folks should get involved in, is campaign planning and how nuclear weapons fit into that. So I'm going to hold that aside, but understand there are other potential roles for nuclear weapons, but those aren't what I'm talking about today. I'm talking about the primary roles of deterrence, deterring enemy attacks, and assuring allies. So what does New START have to do with those two goals? What's the relationship of a treaty to deterrence and assurance? That's the key question, right? What's the relationship of this treaty, or any treaty in general, to deterrence and assurance. And the beginning point, when you're thinking about that question, the beginning of wisdom is to understand that numbers and types of weapons equate to the U.S. ability to have a flexible force structure and a resilient force structure. And what do I mean by flexible and resilient? Sort of buzzwords. Flexible means that we have the forces necessary to have the deterrent threat available as necessary when necessary. And that deterrent threat can vary widely depending on the opponent, the context, the timing, the stakes involved. So we want a nuclear deterrent, or a strategic deterrent with a nuclear component that contributes to deterrence across a wide spectrum of potential threats. That means we need flexibility in our force structure. We also need resilience. Resilience means that our force structure is able to respond to changes rapidly, because the international threat situation changes pretty rapidly. So we need forces that are flexible, and we need forces that are resilient to provide deterrence as best we are able to do that, and to assure the allies. Okay. So think about this. We need a force structure that essentially is very flexible and is very resilient. If you're going to be looking at the measure of merit for an arms control agreement, we'll say, how does that arms control agreement either promote or preclude the necessary flexibility and resilience of our force structure? Let me just mention a bit on that. One, my suggesting that flexibility and resilience are important measures of merit for our strategic forces, and therefore important measures of merit for our arms control, isn't new. It's hardly original. It goes back to Secretary of Defense Schlesinger in 1974. It was carried on by Secretary of Defense Brown. These are bipartisan metrics, that the forces need to be flexible and resilient, because that's what we need them to be for deterrence and assurance. Now, this may sound a bit academic, and I apologize for sounding academic, but it's really an important point, because if you don't understand the requirements for deterrence and assurance in a very dynamic and uncertain threat environment, what you can come to is the following logic, and that is that essentially any set of nuclear forces that the United States has is adequate for deterrence, because any threat of any nuclear threat is big enough to deter any type of attack. So it doesn't really matter whether the forces look like this or whether they look like this. It doesn't matter whether they include low-yield weapons. It doesn't matter whether we have 1,500 or 2,200, as long as you have a large, devastating retaliatory capability, you've got it. Now, if that were true, then the numbers don't make so much difference. They can be important, but they don't make so much difference. If that's not true, then numbers can really matter. So why is it that flexibility is important? Well, flexibility is important, and we've understood it to be important since the 70s and actually since the 60s, again, because we may have to respond to many different types of threats. We don't know what they're going to be 5 years from now, 10 years from now. So how can we agree to a treaty that narrows down our options, narrows down our flexibility, narrows down the resilience of our forces, when we have essentially an unlimited number of potential threats that we would have to prepare for? And you can't prepare for an unlimited number of threats, but you can try and be flexible and resilient enough that you can be ready to deter at least the kind of plausible threats that you think are the highest priority. If all you have is a large, undifferentiated retaliatory nuclear threat, if you go back to the old notion of mutual assured destruction, a large assured destruction type capability. And if you remember back in the 60s, McNamara, Secretary of Defense McNamara, defined that as being able to destroy a certain percentage of the Soviet population and a certain percentage of the Soviet industry, a large, horrific, retaliatory threat. What's the matter with that? Why is that not adequate? Because we don't think that, A, it's very credible in most cases, and B, it's something that the United States is very unlikely to actually implement. If you have a threat that's not credible and the United States is unlikely to implement it other than under the most grievous circumstances, what you have is a deterrent that's useful only in the most narrow occasions. And we don't want a deterrent that's useful for deterrence purposes only in the most narrow occasions. We want a deterrent that can work across a spectrum of threats. Okay. So the most important metric for measuring the New START treaty is what does it do with regard to our flexibility, the flexibility of our forces and the resilience of our forces. So how does the New START treaty look against this measure of merit, this metric? Well, the administration has said that we get some valuable reductions in the Russian capabilities, strategic capabilities from New START. As you know, the claim is 30% reduction in warheads and reduction to 700 launchers, deployed launchers. Those are the terms of the treaty. Let me just suggest that these claims are not true. These claims are just not true. Why aren't they true? They're not true because the ceiling on warheads is so porous that we know the numbers aren't going to be 1,500 if the Russians don't want them to be 1,500. There is no limitation, for example, on long-range cruise missiles, nuclear-armed cruise missiles that might be on surface ships or submarines. There's no limitation whatsoever. You all know the bomber counting rule that counts one weapon on one bomber, no matter how many weapons are on that bomber. So suggesting that there's going to be a 30% reduction in the number of warheads with this treaty is truly an absurdity. It's only true if the Russians want it to be true. What about the launcher numbers? Reduction in Russian launchers down to the 700 ceiling. Here, I'm just going to describe what the Russians have said about that ceiling, because the administration has made a great deal of this reduction to this common ceiling of launchers, of 700 launchers, the launchers being the ICBMs, the SLBMs, and the bombers. Let me just tell you that according to the Russian count of the Russians' own strategic launchers, their number of launchers, they are well below 700 now. They are headed much lower rapidly with or without the New START treaty. So let's see. The New START treaty does not get us a reduction by 30% unless the Russians want to do it. In fact, there could be a 30% increase in the number of warheads under the New START treaty. New START does not get us a reduction in the number of launchers on the Russian side because they're already below the ceiling and headed lower. So the claims of reductions from this treaty are really sort of silly. It does give common ceilings. That much is true. It doesn't require common reductions. This treaty would involve essentially unilateral reductions on the U.S. part with regard to the number of launchers. I noticed when that point was made by Senator Bond in a floor speech on November 18th, the State Department replied very quickly to Senator Bond's speech with a point-by-point response. And Senator Bond made the point that in the number of launchers and the launcher ceilings, the United States would engage in unilateral reductions. The State Department responded and said, that's not true. The State Department is mistaken. It is true. So you got official talking points essentially dissembling about the nature of the treaty. So the value of the treaty, it's not going to provide the reductions claimed. And in fact, in some cases, just the opposite is possible. The administration also says that the U.S. will have the necessary flexibility and resilience of its strategic forces for deterrence within the New START treaty. Now, hear me, because the administration, that's an important point. The administration has made the claim that New START allows the necessary flexibility and resilience of the force structure for deterrence and assurance. Remember, that's what I said, that should be the metric. But let me suggest that in open testimony, the commander of STRATCOM said that conclusion came from analysis that was bounded by the following assumptions. One, there would be no change in U.S. policy. Two, there would be no new requirements. And three, there would be no cheating on the part of the Russians. So the conclusion that the force structure is flexible and resilient enough is bounded by those three conditions. Now just let me ask you the question. Over the next 10 to 15 years, do you think that anyone in this room or anywhere else in this town or anywhere on this planet is able to make the assumptions with confidence that there will be no necessary change in policy, there will be no new force requirements, and that the Russians won't cheat? You know, heroically optimistic assumptions that allow that conclusion to be reached, that the force structure will be flexible, sufficiently flexible and resilient under the New START treaty. Those kind of claims can't be made with confidence by anybody. What was it? Yogi Berra said it's hard to predict, and predicting the future is particularly hard. That's what those kind of claims are based on, and very optimistic predictions. It might be right, but if so, it's by luck. It's by luck. The administration has said that the New START treaty promotes stability, but the definition of that term and that standard is at least troubling to me. What definition does the administration appear to be suggesting for stability, deterrent stability? In congressional testimony, representatives of the administration have said that, for example, that the verification regime is fine because it won't threaten, Russian cheating cannot threaten the U.S. devastating assured second strike capability. Devastating assured second strike capability. Now that may sound fine unless you understand what that means. The U.S. standard for strategic forces for 30 years has not been simply an assured devastating second strike capability because our deterrence requirements are much broader than that. Much broader than that. It harkens back to the old assured destruction notions from the McNamara administration. So we've seen that in some congressional testimony. We've seen it in Russian statements. There's a great Russian statement. I'll give you the, if you're interested in the source, I'll be happy to share it with you afterwards, where the Russians said, the United States presented to us, now this is a Russian speaking in the open Russian press, so please understand it as such, said that the Americans presented to us their plan for minimum deterrence, which would involve a 75% reduction in force levels. Plan for minimum deterrence. U.S. representatives in open testimony talking about assured destruction statements. And if you look at the discussion of the road to nuclear zero, what you see very frequently is we'll go back to assured destruction type thinking. Now, again, you may say, what difference? A nuclear weapon is a nuclear weapon, a deterrent is a deterrent. Not so. We've known since, as I said, the early 70s, we need a flexible capability, we need a resilient capability, or we have a deterrent that's not credible. We have a deterrent that's a bluff. And this is a very dangerous world to have a deterrent that's not credible and is a bluff. So the bottom line with regard to New START and as the primary basis for evaluation, let me just suggest a few conclusions, and then I'll invite questions, Frank, if that's the procedure you'd like. Bottom line, one, we know that the New START Treaty gives up some level of flexibility and some options, both on the offensive side and the defensive side. It gives up some flexibility and some options. Now the question is, does it give up too much? Well, one of the things a couple of things you need to think about when you think, does it give up too much, is what do we get in return? What we get in return is a treaty that is so porous on the offensive limitation side that we are getting no certain reductions on Russian offensive forces. As a matter of fact, if the Russians decide to take advantage of the loopholes in the treaty, there could be a considerable growth in the Russian numbers, if that's what they decide to do. And is there enough flexibility? Is there enough resilience in the forces with New START? The administration has said yes, but you know the conditions that govern that analysis, as presented in open testimony. No new policy, no new requirements, no Russian cheating. Heroically optimistic assumptions. So it seems to me that the administration's case for New START falls to claims about its benefits for deterrence stability, which are wobbly. Reset with Russia, and you can see how the reset with Russia is going. I'll only suggest that I think that claim is equally wobbly. And that it will increase cooperation with allies and others so that we can more effectively promote nonproliferation. That claim, as I said earlier, has somewhere in the middle of the linkage, and then a miracle happens. Because if we wanted to do that, it would be a different treaty. The bottom line to all of these types of points and claims about the treaty is that they seem to be dubious, either to a lesser or a greater extent, but even the lesser extent is pretty highly dubious. Let me leave you with a quote because I think it's very apt for today's situation, but it happens to be a quote from 1954 by George Kennan, who, as you all know, was the father of the U.S. containment policy, which ultimately was a very successful policy and essentially got us successfully through the Cold War. And here's what George Kennan said, referring to the arms control negotiations of the 1920s and 1930s. Think about this for our current context. It says, the evil of these utopian enthusiasms was not only or even primarily the wasted time, the misplaced emphasis, and the encouragement of false hopes. The evil lay primarily in the fact that those enthusiasms distracted our gaze from the real things that were happening. The cultivation of these utopian schemes, flattering to our own image of ourselves, took place at the expense of our feeling for reality. And that, I submit, is exactly what we've been doing here with this set of negotiations and this treaty for well over a year.